One tin soldier rides away.
On the 27th of September 2020. Big agendas, big global agendas, and we know that the biggest internationalists for globalization, for owning the world, by the way, were based in England and London. Yeah? The big organizations that gave you and brought the British Empire into being. Private clubs, basically, massive organizations, but very private. And that's the group, of course, that Quigley talked about for the British branch, the headquarters, and the secondary branch that came off for America, the CFR. And that's how the world's run. It has never changed. These big foundations and organizations don't just give up and say, well, we've completed our task, that's it, over. They continue down through generations, The generations. Any competition, this is something to look at too, I've noticed. Any competition to the big foundations. Now the foundations, as I say, just like communism with all its foundations, back under different names of communism, Marxism, Trotskyism, blah, 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 Society for blah, 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 all these different names that they have for the same huge umbrella organization, are so well funded that they have full-time employees, hundreds, sometimes thousands in some of them, at the top, like a massive bureaucracy, who hire and get trained and work their lives and retire with pensions, and by that time there's others taking over, just like any big business. But unlike business, some businesses can go under. These big foundations don't, you see. They've got unlimited investments at the same time, even though they're tax-free foundations, unlimited. You get taxed on nothing, you see. They can't lose. But they can set up their goals or their manifestos and have all the different things they want to achieve and work for a century or two to achieve it all and add to it as the accomplished parts of the task and have new parts they want to accomplish or conquer too. So that's how it's done. You have no say. This is what runs the world, not your governments. That's what runs the world. Private foundations that have thousands of non-governmental organizations under them and armies of them, from the street fighters to color revolutions to protest groups to many organizations of civil rights groups that are fighting for things you haven't even thought of yet and probably never will. But there's really armies to destabilize and alter and destroy and rebuild by design, not by happenstance and evolution, but by design, by those in control. That's the important part of it. The United Nations likes to refer to them, and so does the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, as state actors and non-state actors. And you also have civic actors, you see, and NGOs. And the NGO groups, there are thousands of them. Fully trained professionals, most of the leaders are, for sure, with incredible financing going towards them, all shaping opinions, cultural changes across the board in every country on the planet, and getting paid to do it and trained to do it and how to do it and so on. But always pretending they're just a local group, just for blah, blah, blah. Until you're in a straitjacket imprisonment system of organizations. They keep giving themselves more authority, like grafting themselves as a little charitable volunteer group onto your local councils until you can't put a garden shed in without sustainability and ecological survey and paying for all. And how are you going to drive, not drive? Should you drive, or should you just get a bicycle if you're 90 years old? Etc. And that's how it's done. This is what runs the world. Actors, state actors, non-state actors, and the non-governmental organization, industry complex. Yeah, that's what it is. It's a massive industry, isn't it? And because you don't vote them in, they can do what they want. And the governments pretend that they're, well, we'll have to listen to them, you know. Do you? Why do you have to listen to them when you won't listen to some spontaneous group that goes with a petition about unlocking us all from COVID? How come you don't get any credence given to you? But any NGO with the proper titles of who backs them financially has got immediate access to governments. You're living in a farce of authoritarianism, an absolute farce. And you don't get a single leader coming out with a uniform so you can hate them. You know, like the Goldstein of 1984 with your 2 minutes of hate every day. You know, you're giving other ones to hate, other groups to hate, and fake ones as well to hate. They've fomented so much hate absolutely in the States right now. It's astonishing to watch it happening. The usual groups are coming out and say, oh, it's really white groups are the biggest problem in America. They were saying that back in the 90s. Same groups. As America's burning. But they won't say that about the white folk leading the Black Lives Matter. Who are they really? Well, we know who they are. And they are part of the NGO-Industry groups. Complex. The NGO-Industry complex. Incredibly well financed and trained at the top. But they always blame a different target of it, because it's a target that might, if they ever did stand up, they're most afraid of. So keep them whimpering and scared and silent and get them guilt-ridden with stuff they haven't done. And you've neutralized them, all psychological warfare tactics, and using threat and fear at the same time. Nothing happens by itself. Albert Pike said it when he was, don't forget, again, he was part of not just Freemasonry, but part of the World Revolutionary Movement, if not the actual main one at the time, and trained Mazzini, and he went out to take over from Pike. But the thing is, the Pike said it so well. He said, how does something grow? Huh? Like something in a field, a tree. Can you just throw the seed there and it'll grow? Well, you might with an awful lot of luck. Huh? But really, if you want to make something happen, you plan it to happen. You prepare the ground. And you get the weeds out. And you churn the soil to get the air into it. You see, that's what helps and so on. It helps the worms and insects and all the bacteria to flourish that it's going to be necessary for the health and survival of that tree. So you do all that kind of stuff in advance. You might even add certain things to the soil to make it better, you see. Like compost, things like that. And then you put the seed down at the right depth, you see, the better depth for survival. And then you cover it, and then you wait, and then you take care of it, the seedling coming up. It's all preparation. And he said, we never, ever, and here's something that's very relevant for today, start a premature revolution. Because a revolution, you see, is just like all the preparation that goes in before you put the seed in the ground to plant for the tree to grow. That's what revolution, a truly well-planned revolution. You prepare the ground. Well, what's the ground? It's the general society. The ground is the target group in revolution. Target group. Those who may oppose you. Well, how would you stop them from opposing you? Take your time. Make sure that you run the school system. You've taken it all over long ago, which is true in America and elsewhere. That's what UNICEF was part of too, mind you. Part of its purpose. And the main worry you're going to have are the males in the populations. So you introduce a different schooling system where you have group consensus in classrooms, knowing that most youngsters want to be accepted by the peer group. They don't want to be shunned. But you can bring in a system whereby if they don't agree with the final diagnosis, say I call it diagnosing a symptom of whatever it happens to be the topic is, you diagnose where they're going, they want you to take you to the conclusion of all. It's like a diagnosis in a sense. And you won't go where the teacher with the toolkit techniques of psychology is taught to try to bring you all to, if one stands out and says, no, I don't agree with that, I wouldn't do that in this circumstance. Well, then you get shunned. Oh, that's terrible. You mean you wouldn't want to do that, and so this certain group over in that country might feel bad, or they might suffer because people like you made it so you wouldn't. You see how you get shamed, yeah? Consequences and shame, things have not even happened. And also, so the guys, it's generally guys with leadership qualities and abilities that will speak out. They think things through. A bit more clearly. So wait a minute here, if we all do this, we'll all end up being wimps, and that's exactly what the whole thing is about. Because they bring in afterwards zero tolerance. If you get struck at school, don't fight back. It's a crime to fight back. And you wait years of this indoctrination, and maybe 10 to 20 years later, you start a real revolution inside the country. And most folk, what you call decent folk, right? The ones their indoctrination has worked on them, won't stop a new group being riled up and raised differently to hate the group that's now adults. You understand, it's really nice tactics for those into warfare games, etc., obviously. But it works awfully well, and it's not genius, really. It's been done before, down through time. But yeah, you raise up the group once you've neutered a previous generation, and whoever children grow up in 10, 15, 20 years, you make sure that you've radicalized them to hate. Oh, they've destroyed the planet. They're terrible, and all different kind of things are added into it, gender differences, things like that. And you stir the pot up and you radicalize them through intensive indoctrination. The same schools that 20 years ago were teaching a generation, or 25 years, a generation not to fight back and to be nice and agreeable and have group consensus. Now you've got this group, a different group, who definitely still have the consensus, but it's a radicalized consensus to hate anybody who's not part of the authorized revolution. It's all been done in advance, and you paid for all through your tax money. Of course you did. I'm not only the people at the top all know this because they're part of it all, and that's how it's done. And that's why you're watching these farces in the cities of mobs being led, guided, financed, incredibly well financed at the top. And the people leading these revolutionary movements, they'll come out as millionaires, some of them, some of the leaders on the streets I'm talking about. The ones who are really well trained, and you see them bust from town to town, city to city, and state to state, a lot of them, right? They're well trained for what they're doing. They're there to get the danger pay of combat troops, really. But they'll get more than that too, because if they're good spokespeople, they'll know how to keep their group in line and to radicalize them further and to keep quiet what their real functions and their real goals and objectives are. They're really good mercenaries, these characters. And with unlimited financing, like all these operations, most of the money goes into their pockets and is not even accounted for. So I really mean it. Some of them know darn well they'll come out as millionaires. Some of them did. They worked over in the Middle East as mercenaries for their own governments. So anyway, we're living through amazing times and amazing systems, and it works because the ground was prepared, and general society was taught to feel bad about things which it had nothing to do with. You think about it too. I won't even fall into the nonsense. I understand it too well. I could give talks on it, no problem at all, about the critical theory, etc., and how the Marxists, that's all part of destabilizing through guilt and complexes, creating a new system of class. Those who have the benefits of being the most victimized are the higher classes. And this is their criteria now. And if you're one of the perpetrators, maybe 500 years ago, or maybe with a possibility of an ancestor being involved somewhere, or even in the genetic line somewhere, then it's you're maybe in the middle. And if you are one of the designated enemy, then you're in the lower classes. Absolutely, it's all your fault. All the world's your fault. And it's incredible how they've worked on people like that, eh? Nothing to do with you. Any more than what the Romans did in ancient times has anything to do with you either. You're only responsible for yourselves now. Not what anybody did in the past. But see, this is warfare strategy. This is what Marxism is. This warfare strategy used by the richest folk on the planet who run the whole system, and they're on all sides at the top. So you can go through your whole life just shaking your head on data. Oh my goodness, you know what they're doing now? Do you believe what Trump said today? Do you believe what Hillary's advocating if Trump doesn't leave office? No, you get this your entire life, this stuff. It's a big play, a big stage, like Shakespeare said it, the whole world's a stage and we're but the players. There's more truth to that than you'd imagine. Absolutely. No doubt at all about it. As I say, when folk are left to try and vote between the lesser two evils, you're not given choice at all then, really. And then when you vote the one in that's less of the two evils, you wonder, well, what country is he serving? What is he serving? Yeah. You have to wonder at times, eh? He's good at putting proposals across, but all the proposals, go nowhere. So it's good for publicity. Like it was going to put down, I think, with Antifa as a terrorist group. I thought they already were a terrorist group. Any group that advocates a complete overthrow of your governmental system and your constitution is automatically a terrorist group. What part of that don't you understand? Again, as I've mentioned it before, even recently again, I mentioned how come Karl Marx was allowed to live in London? He was financed and put up there. He was even given grants occasionally from different people in the bureaucracies and in elite families in Britain. When he was doing his whole thing on the manifesto. And don't forget too, he was no person that drafted that darn thing up. But he's the front man again for that particular project. His name wasn't even on the original books, the manifesto. That's quite something, isn't it? Everything's really something else. Again, when you start talking or thinking, things come to you. I was thinking about the Karl Marx and how he did telegraph Abraham Lincoln. The records are in the U.S. congressional records. They have it, that he congratulated Lincoln for sticking it out with the war and keeping America unified. Centralization of authority, a prime plank of the manifesto. Is it? But also, I think it was in his second or third version, Karl Marx, he wanted to bring in Darwin into his book and mention Darwin and put his name in print in the book as a tribute to Darwin. That's what he said. But in reality, it was, I'm talking about Charles Darwin, but in reality, it was to try to give legitimacy to what was to become, or they hoped, a science, a social science, you see, through this idea of what later became known as communism, a kind of social science, a sociological science, if you like. And the more names he put in print, it backed his book, that would give a kind word to his book he put in print. As many, even modern books do the same thing. It's a wonderful book by so-and-so, says so-and-so off and they'll name a paper or whatever happens to be here, institution. Well, that's what he wanted. And Darwin did agree with it, and he pulled out eventually. thinking that it might tarnish his reputation to be in any way associated with the idea of revolution. But the whole idea of eugenics was part of the revolutionary movement, for those who haven't figured it out. The revolutionary movement uses all sides. It creates sides. It will use them all in unison at times. And other times it will seem to have them fighting each other to get the changes through. Again, the dialectic process. And you find that Darwin's ideas, which were plagiarized, a lot of them from Wallace, who did the actual real legwork, living in jungles and things, and studying and sending it back to Darwin, to Darwin and the Royal Society. But the Royal Society had agreed to promote Darwin up there, because Darwin had the right genes. I really mean that. Eugenics was on the go before Darwin came along, and his family were completely intermarried through generations, just with the Wedgwood family. That was it. Fathers, grandfathers, and Darwin himself. They were selectively picking appropriate inbreeding, they thought, so you can really run with this stuff. This is all verifiable. There's nothing fake about it. But yeah, legitimacy was to be given. But the nobility grabbed it and said, well, we always said that the peasant class were different, and they had all kinds of theories before the 20th century. It was bad blood, and it was this and that was other, and yeah. But this gave a scientific. But yes, because the genes pass on the same stupidity to the inferior classes, you see. And they'd had it on the go since the days of Thomas Malthus, the same ideas of too many of the wrong people breeding, but would the planet would basically just collapse with the weight of all, I suppose. That was the ideas that was put across there. And again, with charts and graphs, just like the COVID thing, Malthus tried to prove there's too many folk and what would happen in 100 years' time, 200 years' time, and that kind of stuff, and so on. It never ends. It's the same agenda with different covers, you see. Those in control of this world, in control over people, are always petrified of the general public. They always have been. Because their whole basis for legitimacy of ruling over you is with a kind of consent by the general public to do so. Fraudulent it might be and fake, and today definitely, but in the old days you need a titular head of some kind to give legitimacy and credence to law, etc. And that's how monarchy got a foothold a long time ago. Today it's massive think tanks that work on behalf of governments and institutions, like to call themselves institutions, that you don't vote for once again. And a government that really doesn't know much, as I say, from the politicians. They don't know much. They're little sharp characters themselves, men and women, with big ambitions for themselves. And they all know you'll become awfully rich with a career serving the public, but, not from your pension, obviously, but this magic money, some stuff comes to you get the right investments, and the state. I remember the Congress in America a few years ago gave themselves the rights to use insider information for their own personal investments. That used to be illegal before. In other words, you make policies, know who's going to benefit, and you can make investments in this corporate. It's so corrupt, openly corrupt. Although it's not corrupt anymore because it's legal for them. But we're living through such an amazing display of what I call conology. And you're conned, and you must participate in the con. That's why you vote. You vote out of desperation, really. And to get the one that you voted in the last time out, because you're so disgusted with them, that's why you vote the new bunch in. Only you find out nothing much changes, The same agendas continue, the same agreements are countersigned and strengthened, like it used to be called the NAFTA deal, North American Free Trade Agreement, and now it's the U.S., Canada, America agreement. USMCA, you call it now. Same agreement, just a fancy title change because it was just too easy to say NAFTA. So many in the public understood it by then, and so you just changed the name of it. Oh, that's gone. NAFTA's gone. But it's the same agreement. Of course it is. It's fixing trade. And you as a small company have got to have a hard time exporting anything without permission by the boards that are set up, these star chambers, through the WTO as well, World Trade Organization, because you're not authorized. You might have paid all the licenses, but they won't give you one for export, perhaps, you see. If you're going to cut into, or perhaps even remotely compete with even a big corporation, which is silly. You start with little old you in a big corporation, and so you won't get the business. It's like postage in Canada. Maybe the States is the same. I'm sure British Commonwealth countries are all the same with the postage. You can, if you were posting a few books every week, maybe about even 2 or 3, maybe even a month, you won't get the deals that the corporations can get for either flyers or these little newspapers they'll print up. Maybe 4-page, free flyers and things. You won't get the deals, the incredible deals that are given per copy if they do so many hundreds per week. And you can't even get 2 or 3 a week, but you ain't going to get that kind of. So you'll pay maybe 10 times more for the same for the postage to the same places. There's nothing in this system is there for the ordinary person, really, nothing at all. Except the propaganda that's laid. A lot of propaganda goes into creating you and the mind that you have and your opinions that you have. But that's how it really is, and we don't like to look at it and see it that way. But I remember giving talks in the 90s. This is the system, especially the financial system, is probably, this whole system relies, at the top of it all, the head of this big serpent is the financial system. Well, I'll say that on the earthly plane, put it that way, but it's a financial system. Everything underneath it runs off the trickle-down theory of loot, getting dished out to different organizations and politicians and so all the way down, you see. And that's how it really works. It's loot. And that's why Rothschild quite openly said it in his own books and so on about Rothschild and biographies and the different Rothschilds. And he said it. He said that put me in charge of a nation's money, currency, and I don't care, he says, who you put in as government, Prime Minister. Because obviously, you'll see it throughout your life. And Britain was more open, where the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Prime Minister would go to see the big lenders about borrowing money. And with every loan comes conditions. And these conditions aren't all financial. They'll be null and void unless you change policies here. That's where, you look at your government giving money out to all these third world countries that can never pay it back. But don't worry, you the taxpayer are put down by your nations as the guarantors if they fail to pay it back or write it off. See? That's how it works. But along with them, these ones like the IMF or the World Bank, issues across the world, comes conditions about gender equality, which ends up being really an attack on marriage, the destruction. Don't forget the planks of the Communist Manifesto. The richest folk on the planet financed it all, still do. Richest people. And the big club at the top. Big club. And as George Carlin said, and you're not a member. George Carlin. So anyway, that's how it really works. It's all money and finances and conditions to every loan. I was shocked. It was something that Hillary Clinton, when she was in the State Department, said to some countries that from now on we won't be giving any money out to any country. And she laid out a list of stipulations, and Africans were shocked, some African countries. This is, their women will end up like prostitutes if they go along with this, that some of the leaders in the countries said. They couldn't believe it. It was a right to, some of these countries have natural cultural taboos on decency. Because they don't have the welfare systems to take care of runaway children. And so marriage is promoted. Isn't this amazing? This is parts of Africa we're talking about. They used to lambast Africa as being backwards. We're the backward countries now because a war has been waged upon you for a long time and you don't even know it. Everything you went along with was for the greater good, right? And progress. Look around you. But yeah, Hillary Clinton had all these different regulations laid out for the loan. I was just astonished. But that's how it's all done, you see. And that's how it's done with your nations as well. Bailouts and so on. But here's the caveats, and you have to do this, that, and that. That's how it's done. That's how it's done. When Japan came to America to get loans before World War I, and met Baruch and different characters there, the loans stipulated, and this was found after World War II, by the Marines when they went into Japan proper in Tokyo. Then they found the old agreements that initially the American bankers will say agreed to finance the improvement and the modernization of Japan's navy and military, and had the conditions laid out that Japan then must attack Russia. This all came out in history. This is not conspiracy theory here. Yeah? In fact, I think the agreement's on display in a museum now in the States. And it caused a little bit of stink at the time. It was hushed over, but the fact is that it did come out. That was agreement, and there's a reason for that too, by Baruch and other ones that had financed it. Do you think about it? People can lend money out to get other nations to go and attack other nations. You're seeing the same thing with the funding of riots on your streets today. How can you pretend you've got something called democracy when the richest folk on the planet can finance revolutions anywhere in the world rather quickly by sending around the world, which they've done, by the way, leaders of these particular terrorist organizations? Don't forget the terrorist organization, if they've overthrow a nation, which can happen, because the tactics are classic. They're being used in America right now. Quite fascinating to watch it, because they're classic. And the fact that they're well organized, well run. The idea is to terrorize the average American citizenry. They'll do nothing. That's what was in Fight Club, the movie Fight Club, the comedy, where they set a group up for revolution, and they even experiment on Joe Public. And passers-by would pass gardens and things, or fences, or gates, and the folk in the gardens would just suddenly soak them with hoses, or chase them, or throw things at them. And the hardest thing they said in the comedy was to get folk to physically fight back. Because folk are decent, law-abiding, yada yada. What chance do you have against terrorists? Is it? So psychologically, the effect of the TV massive pounding would give you the impression of the whole of America was burning. That's a perception management task, you see. And that's why the media is all on board with it. Still calling them peaceful protests as you see the buildings all burning down and cars on fire. And mobs chasing cars on the streets and smashing their windows, unlike it happened with that Prius in California the other day too. Etc. I mean, it's just never ended. But this is all with a collusion with a big powerful organization that runs all media, obviously. The deep state isn't something stuck in a back alley somewhere. It is your system. That run. You've been oblivious to it, thinking it was all individually owned and private, etc., private business. No. These corporations are part of the whole system of revolution. You fund most of their enterprises with public-private partnerships for the greater good, to say. Yeah, so I gave talks, as back in the 90s, about the system, how corrupt and broken it was. And how they kept trying to keep it, and being kind of semi-successful. And I likened it to the Tower of Babel. I said, there's so many band-aids on it, because it's swayed in the wind for so many, thousands of years, that it's broken, cracked, And it's got all these band-aids on it from countless defaults and bank crashes, all planned, of course, to loot the general public over and over, and how you always get at least twice a century, at least two big crashes as they declare bankruptcy and loot you all. And then you all have to bail them out with loans your government takes from the same characters that cause them, because they're giving you nothing back really except numbers on paper or on a computer. And then they're telling you that's legitimate, and your government agrees because they're all part of the con, and they're all financed themselves. And then they put you down to pay back all the money that was lost. Really stolen. Money doesn't disappear like that. Stolen. Big crashes. So you see, the big Tower of Babel is towers above you all. And there's countless. There's even many books came out after 9/11, sure, but also after, and all the wars that you're still paying for today. But also with the crash of 2008. All the books and how the biggies all knew it was coming, how they had moved all their own cash into secure places, etc., and how they actually accelerated and helped all to happen, and how the governments and the overseers of these big institutions that work for government, how they turned a blind eye right to the bitter end about the banks were buying up by the thousands per day mortgages. They were flipping mortgages like the commodities. Until after the crash, they're still trying to figure out who eventually actually owns a lot of these properties. Utter corruption and collusion. Nobody was jailed for it. You had 10 cities of folk who'd all lost their homes. Generally the poorer folk that fell for these, no money necessary, this is a government back these things up for you, yada, yada. Poor soul. Horror stories came out of it. Again, quickly forgotten again, or hushed or quietened down, And they planned it from then on, They said that 2008 was only the first wave of this massive collapse. Well, who said that? All the biggies of the Council on Foreign Relations, this quiet advisory government that you have. And they come as advisors to government. We advise them on what to do or else. And the second one was still like, here you are with the second one. And they've compounded it with a COVID idea. That's a good one, isn't it? When more folk dying 2 years before with flu. But the world wasn't shut down with that. That doesn't matter. This is a necessary thing for the big agenda, obviously. Obviously, since they're turning on the public with military precision and military angst. Military angst is important. If you see, when the military has to go out and force an enemy to the death, face them to the death, you'll see the guy's expressions. They call it resolute, And with those who lead them, because they're all on board with it. And you've got to be resolute if you're facing an enemy, right? But you're seeing the same thing turned on the public right now with absolute glaring authoritarianism of resolution. They've all sworn to each other and the big organization that they all belong to. The real boss, not the public, to go through with this to the bitter end, to change the economy and the system and the culture and what's left of culture and the whole system, way of living from birth to death, permanently, using COVID. Some of these things I might touch on tonight, but I don't want to overwhelm folk with just too many details they can look it up themselves. I can give you a lot of the links and so on. But it's overwhelmingly evident what's going on, and there's nothing left to the imagination. It's your own unwillingness to believe it. That's what it is. And they're following it to the end, the letter to the end. This whole idea of a complete lockdown across the world, if they can get away with it. And using terror again, and bogus tests. These tests are so bogus, they're a joke. And so many of the doctors have come out and say the same thing. Lab workers have come out and said the same thing. But facts don't matter. It's in a huge agenda. Because it was before they gave you the idea of COVID, maybe even gave you COVID, because it did come out of a lab supposedly, it didn't develop by itself, not with the 4 inserts that it's got on it. Then obviously that the darn thing was all planned to begin with, before it got loose. Even the basis for the vaccine, this new type of vaccine, the basis for it was there like a base model that they could adapt and add on to according to particular types of viruses, coronaviruses. All set up and ready to go. Has been for a few years. And then what happens to you? Well, they don't know yet, they claim. They don't know yet. They just hope, cross fingers, Yeah, before they had folk paralyzed now with the test subjects. And little inconveniences like that, you see, but they want to ram it through into your system regardless. Well, I go back to Como, the one-man disaster for New York City, who, like some other places, including like Scotland as well, did the same thing, mandated that infected should be put into old folks' homes too, which were uninfected till they put in infected patients. And we saw what happened there, and they've got the numbers skyrocketing, of course. Both socialist, of course, ultra-socialist. And it gave credence again as the numbers went up and up and up of infected people and in deaths. But don't forget, with the tests they're using, the swab tests, for the particles, that shows particles of dead viruses. You don't even need to have had the darn thing to have the multiple particles in your nostrils or your sinuses or in your throat. They're all over the place around you. And that's what it's picking up, dead particles. It's such an incredible scam. Remember years ago, I'm reading articles. I won't even go in there, it's just too in depth. Because in any of these areas, you can talk forever about it. But yeah, it's a scam, and it's planned that way. And the World Economic Forum has come out again. I'll put the article up. Once again, they've said the same thing as the Club of Rome said openly too, and how they can achieve their whole agenda for sustainability by using COVID, and who can open up businesses and who can't, if it's environmentally friendly or not, according to panels, secretive panels and star chambers, etc. Because there's no real legal system set up that you can go and protest against anything here. There's nothing. And your pretended democracies. Now, once again, folks, I remind you to cuttingthroughthematrix.com. List all the sites I have there. And take the links and paste them somewhere securely so you can get them. Because if the com site goes down again, which I might get attacked again, there's no doubt about it, or at least the servers I'm using to host, that is, and then you can get the other sites, hopefully. And again, when you're there too, remember, you can buy the books and discs, or just straight donations you can send to me by personal check, or send cash. Cash is fine. Or MoneyGram. I'm not selling you ideas of who to vote for. Or I'm not selling you pure optimism either. I never came out initially to give you just optimism. The optimism is an understanding. It's its own optimism. Understanding the whys and wherefores will make you less fearful when you really understand why things are happening. You'll also see what's going to happen along the way and prepare perhaps for it. Mental preparedness stops a lot of anxiety. Never mind physical preparedness, but mental for sure. You don't fall for the next terror attack of psychological warfare put out by professionals, meaning your own governmental agencies, the ones that run your government, or the CIA or MI6 or Mossad. And all the other organizations all collude together. And they do collude together. They always did. Some of the top agents in Britain would meet in pubs in London. In MI5 and 6, especially MI6, they'd meet their counterparts across in different countries. They'd meet them all. They'd meet the Russian spies and agents, and they'd meet in bars and favorite places across capitals across the world They'd all meet at different times and bump into each other, and they'd get pally, and they exchange a little bit of superficial information you pass back to well, you wouldn't guess what I found out about what Russia's up to now, what they're up to, Things like that, a little trivia. But a lot of them got to know their counterparts because they're in the same business of collecting and supplying information to their masters. And eventually they could see through. They'd often say in their memoirs that and if you met any of them personally, they had no personal axes to grind. They weren't. It's not like the movie type thing where they did everything for patriotic duty. They did a bit of excitement. They got paid for it. They got a lot of good travel. They got investment tips like you wouldn't believe, because so much of what they were trying to find out in different nations was investment money and where the future trends are going in big businesses for their masters back home. A lot of it was like that. But most of them didn't do what they did for ideological purposes. Certain ones were sent in to nations as operatives who really were on the line, the tightrope, that would get killed if they were found out. But the higher up type agents that went back and forth and they knew their counterparts in the different countries or agencies, they generally were okay. It was the real operatives that were sent in that got the chop off. And Kim Philby used to literally work for MI6. He was recruited, like most of them were, by Rothschilds. The Cambridge Five, The Cambridge spies, anyway. This was ordering for the fifth man, although Blake came later. But as I say, that you find out that the Rothschilds, the banking family, put them up, a lot of these as students, and recruited them. And because he gave the say that these are good chaps, there was no background checks in some of them. That's how it was done. Even Blake, who came later, got the same kind of clearance. He was never checked out at all. Even though he was from Poland, and communist. And interesting background, but his uncle was, his uncle owned the Bank of Israel at that time. He himself was communist, supposedly. Because, as you know, by now, communism is a name, a front for a much bigger organization, I'd say. But anyway, agents would tell you that the system is vastly different than anything you'd imagine. Vastly different. But Philby, getting back to him before I get off it, he literally would get information of operatives being sent into different Warsaw Pact countries. And they'd land them in through parachute, different techniques, and so on, get them into the countries or smuggle them across borders. And they're all getting picked off. So he would actually meet some of them and be sitting in the Opry, and then he'd go out the back door pretty well and signal his counterparts that they'd be arriving and so on and so on. He was responsible for a lot of the folks' deaths. That's really how it was run. And you have to wonder who they all came from the upper crust, these spies, A lot of title families as well, who worked as spies and double agents. It was actually harder to get that quality of spy or double agent from the working classes, because the working classes were more patriotic, because the propaganda always worked better on them. They really believed it was their country and decent folk own it and run it and manage it for us. And of course, a lot of it comes from the fact that the ordinary folk have a much tighter bond with each other, I think, a more human bond to begin with, anyway. So as I say, before I get on to the next hour, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, send a few bucks my way and help me tick along. Because, as I say, I don't have an axe to grind, and I've walked between the raindrops for so many years on different shows, and then on my own for a while too. But still walking between the raindrops, because really you're not really authorized to play the big game here on behalf of maybe big operations, Because most of the things out there are not quite what you think that they really are. Now, as I've said, the Tower of Babel really is, at least rather precarious at times, with its band-aids and it sways in the wind and creaks and groans, but don't think for a second that somehow the people at the top who've run the world successfully for an awful long time, who knows how long actually, centuries, at the very least, many centuries at least, stand back and just let it happen. They always plan ahead for the next system, and now that it's all coming along into digital currency, they don't even have to print up banknotes, of course, to say, well, here's physical nothings. It represents nothing, but it's physical, and psychologically it seems more, it was tangible. It's not gold or silver or whatever, but it's tangible. It's paper at least, so, but you don't even have that now. You have blips that can come and go down the memory hole too if they ever want to wipe out your accounts, which will happen once you're on the total universal basic income. It'll start with them too, as the government withholds money because you've been bad or you said something naughty, you see. One of the things that you shouldn't say, and as they keep adding to the list of things you mustn't say, or even think for that matter, as you get trained to comply and be subservient and be a good pirate. That's the only way you'll survive at all. That's what Orwell showed you in 1984, a deadpan face in the movie, the one that John Hurt was in, and never show expressions of surprise or emotion or anything, because it's all on camera, right? So you're living through it, and it's all planned. It's a massive plan. I've said it at the WEF, World Economic Forum. Don't forget, the World Economic Forum is a private, massive club that was never voted in by the general public anywhere, just like the United Nations. And, it's a massive club. Started up supposedly by one front man, Klaus Schwab. And, to do good for the world, which enriches the ones who are already rich, etc. You don't want them getting poor, do you? You don't want to be ruled by poor bums, do you? You want rich bums. So, it's a benevolent thing. And the richest people on the planet belong to it. Governments are completely subservient to it, even though it's never been written into a law that they've got power over anybody. It's astonishing how you live in a system where everyone's obeying in obedience to these organizations, It tells you that what you think is your government isn't isn't that way at all. It's a different institution. Obviously. But it's a big pretense. As I've said before, they don't give you a guy with a uniform on that comes out yelling in front of the camera. They give you people in business suits. And they prefer if you at least go through the semblance of voting them in, at least, And that way you'll turn, so that person has let us down so badly, I'm not going to vote for them again. And it keeps the whole pretense up, rather than just strip it all away and say who's really running the show. And as I said before, if you could possibly fire all the politicians today, you'd be strange enough, the government, your country would keep working. If that's what it is right now, I don't know if it's working or not, but it would keep going. Whether they're or not. It would take a little bit of time before the real forces behind the scenes would come forward to start to dictate policies, you see. But it's a good sham, it's a good chronology, because the con is that you vote them in, and they're there to work for you on your behalf. And then all you'll hear them talk about is special rights for different minorities, including new inventions and minorities and classifications as time goes on, all to suit the agenda and change society again. That's what it's really for. You don't give a darn about anybody or preferences or anything else. They'll use them all, but you don't care. Any more than they care about the poor folk who are starving in some places. They don't care. These politicians are born liars. But the psychopathic group that become politicians, they smell the power out and they go for the power. They look for the power. And they find it. And they like to have a praise from the public too, and be looked up to and have a name in the papers like a star, you see. They love that acclaim and applause. Attention-seeking type psychopaths. And before I go into any topics or stories, to touch on again, why would your own country, what you think is your own country, be financing and allowing the financing of revolutionary groups inside your countries, especially those who are dedicated to overthrowing the entire system. That tells you the system was overthrown a long time ago, maybe, or else it was never the system you imagined it to be. It's a very malleable system, isn't it? Where it can fight against certain things when it suits them and their corporate interests. And then, after a certain time, it just turns on its own public that might be, at least verbally, fighting the same system. But those who run your governments are all for allowing your cities to burn. I mean, it makes no sense to realize that whoever runs your countries is not from you, the people. And really, it never really was. Before they had to give more lip service to have any credence amongst the public. But they really don't have that anymore. They'll cater to it, what they say is, and that's what they've done. Rather than serve the general public in the supposed democracies, right? Which means you fulfill agendas that you run on, and democratic systems. Even in democratic Republican systems, meaning democratic, you vote. You get to vote people in. That's a democratic bit, but it doesn't really work that way because you don't really vote them anyway. They're put in. But the idea is to keep the idea of democracy going, to stop you realizing of all the folk behind the curtain, you see. The ones that Benjamin Disraeli talked about. And he's one of his novel, I think it was Coningsby, I think, a novel, where he's talking about government and a civil servant, and he says that government is those who really rule the nation behind the curtain are vastly different people from the ones that you see. They give you lots of little clues and tips, don't they? But that's how it is. And you can figure that out for yourself anyway after doing enough study and right, even in your own lifetime, just to study stuff in your lifetime you've seen. And look at all the promises made. Then you see once they're in, rather than cater to the majority that supposedly elect them in, right? They'll say in democratic countries, well, they're supposed to serve the majority, but listen to the minorities, give the minorities little protections and so on. All they do is talk to minorities. That's taken over from the majority. And it gives the impression that they're listening to people. They're not listening to the rest of the people. They're listening to selected groups that tell them what they want them to hear. Or to ask them even, oh sure, we'll pass laws to do it. It's all to do with passing laws, isn't it? Everything that happens is people shouldn't talk about pass a law until you're hamstrung, as they call it. With laws. That's the old communist technique. The Bolsheviks did that when they got in. They passed law after law after law. You couldn't speak, you couldn't do this, you couldn't talk about blah, blah, blah. Until you were completely hamstrung, you were silenced, you see. Socialism always does the same technique. And when the same elite multi-billionaires want socialism, they'll give you socialism. It's a faster way to do it. When they want more from you, or more compliance from you, more public spiritedness from you. They'll give you more freedoms for a while as they still fleece you, you see. So they've got to be a little bit more free and easy and always point to their country. You wouldn't believe what they do in those countries to people who are convicted of this. You wouldn't believe what they do. Well, they don't bother with that so much now, do they? Because it's all happening in your own countries. Quietly too. Maybe sometimes not so quietly. But anyway, it's a farce, isn't it? But it's all to suit the masters at the top. And I read articles today just about the lockdowns coming again in England. And I've said that at the beginning, I said, listen to what they said. They're going to have you locked down for at least a year, maybe two, you know. Now they're stretching it to 2 years. And they give you a little bit of a break in the summer. I said, to do that, just to ease up a bit, make you smile and be happy a little bit, rather than have you all rebelling. They don't want rebellion, you see. And that's how they do it. They play it by ear. And by ear, meaning electronic ear, because they've got the finger on the chat in real time on the net, you see. They know exactly who's, through all the algorithms, precisely, in real time, a pretty well accurate percentages of who's against this lockdown and the rest of it, and how to manage it, and how to get round, how to break your resolve, etc. Or to convince you by bigger scares and what they need to do to make it happen. This is how it's played today. It's massive psychological warfare on the general public. But facts don't matter when a big agenda is at play. This is a war strategy. What can we use? Well, global warming's not working for them. They won't swallow it. They won't cut back. They won't get out their cars. They won't blah, blah, blah. Well, here you go. Here's COVID. Let's use COVID. We'll use that. And California, you probably noticed there too, they're cutting back on all car use altogether. Well, it's much healthier for right out of the playbook, eh? They said that they wouldn't allow things to open up. They weren't sustainable and environmentally friendly. The whole agenda, the climate change agenda, it's all sustainability. Climate change was hit upon by the Club of Rome when they were given the task to find something that we'd believe and would agree to and give up certain rights and privileges and all the rest of it for the greater good. And they hit upon the idea of global warming, famine, drought, and the like would fit the bill. That would fit the bill. That's what they said in their own books. So, but the whole point is there's too many people. Behind it all, they've said that there's too many people. How many articles have come out even again recently by the same culprits telling you there's too many people, it's inevitable. It's going to get worse and worse because there's too many folk consuming. And then even right down to too many folk breeding, especially to the West, where the birth rate's always been plummeting, except for massive migration with children. Most migrants are the ones with the children, you see, to get the numbers up. Otherwise, it'd be way down, way down. But again, facts don't matter, agenda-driven, eh? Anyway, from myself, Alan Watt from Ontario, Canada. We've had lots of rain recently. It's good night. May your God or your gods go with you.